but you know, I'm a dancer, or I was a dancer, and Virgil Thompson said that dancers are a big bore because they have no conversation and they're autoerotic. So in my case, the speaking will be autoerotic, but I'll try not to. It's not true, by the way. I went to New York to dance, to learn to dance, and I was very fortunate. I was asked to join a company very shortly after that happened, although actually I didn't dance all that well, but I had what they called quality, you know, which is you can't do things very well, but it's kind of interesting to look at the mistakes. I was dancing with Merce Cunningham, and it was really very difficult to dance and to learn to dance better. And it occurred to me that if it was this difficult to learn dancing, how much more difficult it might be to learn what everything was about. And that one couldn't expect to know it without spending a little bit of effort on it. I had, when I was a child, I remember sitting out in a garden once and sort of looking at trees and flowers and thinking, isn't it a pity that I can only see this through my own eyes, that I can never really see what it's like, because everything is filtered through what I know and what I think. And I remember thinking what a pity that was. So maybe that had something to do with my wanting to know what things were really about. In any case, I was living in a kind of perhaps semi-respectable poverty in a cold water flat on the Lower East Side. And I got books and books and books about spiritual things. I used to read the lives of saints. St. Catherine of Siena, who could eat nothing but the communion wafer, and still ran hospitals and told the Pope of her time how to run the world. I thought that was marvelous, but I like to eat. I read books about Zen Buddhism. John Cage, who was involved in the Cunningham Company, was very much into Zen Buddhism, and I was always a little rebellious, so that didn't quite suit me. I read The Imitations of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, very depressing. You know, you laugh, but if you knew the state of your soul, you would weep. Well, I wept enough anyhow, without knowing the state of my soul. In any case, I had a friend whom I had met through dance classes, who came to visit me once after class, and she saw all this hodgepodge of spiritual literature, and she said, "What on earth are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I want to find out what everything's about." And she said, "Well, you know Margaret Krask, we were both going to the Metropolitan Opera Ballet School where Margaret Krask taught." So Margaret Krask spent 7 years in India with a master. And if you're interested, you can make an appointment with her and she'll tell you about it. Well, you know, this was the early 50s. Masters I didn't know about. Even though I had left, I had stopped going to church. And that was a very wild thing. I was christened a Lutheran, then I was confirmed congregational, and then I went to the Unitarian church, and then I stopped. But I had always sort of liked Jesus, and as a matter of fact, I had gotten in trouble in the Unitarian church, where they said it's Jesus and Thoreau and Emerson, and I said, well, I think Thoreau and Emerson were marvelous, but maybe Jesus was a little bit different. And that was not what you were supposed to say. And they had changed the words of all the hymns, now the lovely spring is here instead of Christ the Lord is risen today. Anyhow, so I was sort of great. Somebody spent some time with a master, but I didn't know what that meant. But I decided that I would go crazy unless I found a way. I couldn't mix up everything. I would go mad. So every evening I would call Margaret Krask. And every evening, there was no answer. So I felt very easy about it. I'd go home and I'd dial, and I'd know she didn't answer. So I felt I was doing what I could, but I didn't have to commit myself in any way, and that was fine. Of course, one evening she did answer, and I said I wanted to come and see her, and she said, why? Any of you who know her can imagine that it was not an easy thing to make this phone call. And I was somehow, the word Baba seemed odd to me, and I didn't want to say it. So I said, well, I want to see you about the whole thing. And she said, what on earth are you talking about? So I gritted my teeth and I said, I wanted to talk to you about Baba. So she said, fine, come and see me. And I did. And she lived in a hotel room. And there were pictures of Baba everywhere. And I was not one of those people who looked at Baba's picture and thought, that's my man. Not at all. She told me about Baba, but I can't really remember what she told me about Baba. But it was clear to me that this is what life had presented to me, and I'd better just take it because I didn't know what else to do. She had drawers full of pictures of Baba, and she allowed me to choose a picture to take home with me. And when I say drawers full, I am not exaggerating. And I was very sort of superficially very polite. And so I didn't want to rummage through her drawers and pick a picture that I really liked, and I took the one that was on top, which I didn't particularly like. And Miss Cross told me to look at this picture for 10 minutes every day. She also said, as I was leaving, are you sure you want to do this? And I, like a fool, I smiled and said, oh, yes. And she looked very, very grave, very serious. And she said, well, it's very hard. Well, that didn't really mean anything to me at that time. I know more and more what she's talking about. Unlike Liz really, yesterday, she aimed for the top. She wanted to be God realized. I don't think I knew there was such a thing, but what I wanted to be was a saint. That was good. So I hope that by looking at, I had gone to see the Song of Bernadette. She scrubs floors. And I thought that would be, not the scrubbing floors, but to be saintly while scrubbing the floors, I thought would be marvelous. So I thought if I looked at Baba's picture, maybe for 10 minutes every day for a week, I could be a saint. Halo, everything. In any case, it was very hard to find the 10 minutes. And we all have 10 free minutes a day, but it was very hard to find them. I made myself sit there and look at this picture. And it meant nothing to me. But I did it. And I remember at one point during this... Absolutely. During this time of trying to look at the picture, I thought, well, I could look at a picture of George Washington for 10 minutes every day, and it would begin to resonate in me in some way. Never mind. I was full of doubt from the beginning. I went on, and finally, I developed this wonderful, wonderful, very private, very intimate relationship with this picture. you know, is this picture in me, and it was lovely. You know, I can't remember what year this all was, but in any case, during all this time, Miss Krask, who had a very, very busy professional life, was just amazing. We could, whenever anything difficult happened, we would go running to her, and she would sit and listen to our stories, and with great kindness and often great sternness, she would take care of us. She never told us what to do, however. And she would continue to tell us about Baba. And then in '56, he was to come to New York. So several of us dancers went to the airport to meet him. My first glimpse of him was as he was going through the customs. And I realized this thing I had with the picture was not what it was. I had never seen any creature like this. And you know, he was a small man, but he was bigger than anything. He didn't talk, but the life that came from him was just unbelievable. And I had by this time met, quote, important, unquote, people. Baba was something so above and beyond that, that it was, in a way, an extraordinary shock to see this creature. There's a description of Baba physically that Purdom wrote, and it's so beautiful and it so much expresses really what I felt that I thought I'd read it to you. Is that all right? Okay, this is Charles Purdom from The God-Man. Recognition of Meher Baba as God-Man must influence one's thinking of him as a man. In his divine nature, the God-Man possesses infinite knowledge, power, and bliss. But in his person, his human nature causes him universal helplessness and suffering. His infinite power and bliss are not used, while his infinite knowledge has self-imposed limitations. Because the world is imperfect, Baba's body shares in that imperfection. But he is conscious of the fact, and in that sense his body is different from our bodies. It looks the same, feels the same, is subject to heat and cold, liable to disease and to accident, and is in fact indistinguishable from a normal body. Yet it is impossible to avoid the impression that there is a difference from the normal body. His eyes, expression, touch, walk, posture, and use of his hands are peculiarly his own. Certainly something of the sort could be said of any outstanding person, but it is none the less true that it is characteristic of outstanding men to be much like ordinary men, even indistinguishable from them. That at least has often been my experience. With Baba, there is no mistaking his uniqueness. It is not that there is an atmosphere of occult powers, or that some influence appears intentionally to emanate from him, but the strangeness is nonetheless there. The more one sees of him, the more unshakable is that impression. And I can say that after more than 30 years of knowing him, it never diminishes. Well, there was that strangeness that Purdom talks about. Here he was a human being, clearly a person, and yet there was something so different about him. Anyhow, we spent that whole week that he was at the Hotel Delmonica. We went there in the morning and stayed through the afternoon. The first time we saw him as a group, the dancers, we were not a group, but we were not an organized group. But he got Margaret Krask and the dancers in together, and he talked to us. And then I think it was on the second day, each of us got to go in to see him alone. We went alone to see him, obviously. There were other people there. We had all made things for him. I had brilliantly knitted him a white scarf, and I felt so stupid going in there. It suddenly occurred to me that India is a hot country. And here I was with this white woolen scarf. But knitting was sort of the only handicrafty thing I could do. I walked in, somebody mercifully took this scarf from me, so that was forgotten. And there was Baba, and he embraced me, and that was the most real moment in my life. And it was like being at home, being where I knew I belonged, and everything was there. It was complete. There was nothing missing. And it was a most extraordinary experience. I had often had a kind of nostalgia, which had nothing to do with being homesick for my home, for my family home. And I'd never known what it was, what was this nostalgia? Well, it was for Baba, obviously. And there he was. And I can't even quite remember. I sort of have the impression that I was sort of curled up on his lap, which I don't think I could have been. He was much smaller than I was. But there's this wonderful moment. I don't know how long it went on. And that was it. I also admire those of you who love Baba so very much without ever having met him. I'm not at all sure that I could have. I needed that wonderful homecoming with Baba in a body. We stayed there for the rest of the week, and there were some things I remember. For instance, we were in a big room with a lot of people. Baba was sitting in the front of the room, and people came to see him. And I remember two boys who were quite unattractive looking as they came in the door. And as they came close to Baba, it was as though someone had turned on a light inside them. It was the most extraordinary thing to see. They were suddenly beautiful because they had taken on some of Baba's beauty. There were just amazing, lovely things that happened like that. In any case, as you probably know, in '56, there was this whole trip around the country that Baba was doing. I had not been told about that, and I think partly it was because I had absolutely no money. There was no way I could have gone on that trip. So when Baba left, some of us who were not going stood and waved goodbye, tears streaming down our faces. Baba went. So we had to smile. But one of the places he was going was Washington, D.C., and my parents lived in Washington. And my parents wanted to meet Baba, not particularly because they were interested in Baba, but because they were interested in me. And I told them about this master, and they thought, what in the world is she up to now? So I went to Washington on a weekend, and people were seeing Baba in Ivy Deuce's house. I brought my parents to Ivy's, and it was just jam-packed full of people. And I was asked what group my parents and I belonged to. My parents didn't belong to a group. I didn't belong to a group. Margaret Crass came along, and she sort of made a wedge in all this group of people. And in we went to see Baba. Well, at the Delmonico, there were so many people that I certainly didn't imagine that Baba would remember me. We got into this room. Baba was there, and Erich was there. Baba's face lit up, and Erich said, Baba says you have made him very happy. My father, who was a European intellectual, walked up to Baba to shake hands. Baba just took him and embraced him. My mother, who was rather heavy at the time, just raced into Baba's arms. So that was a lovely thing. Then we left. I'll tell you some more little details. When I had first heard about Baba, I felt that something that I had learned to consider a fairy tale, the whole idea of Christ, which I finally decided was something, a lovely sort of myth invented to make us all feel better about our situation. When I heard about Baba, I thought, well, this is true, and how absolutely wonderful. And I would sit on the subway and just think, we really are living this thing that I thought was a fairy tale. And it just seemed like the most extraordinary gift. I told people about Baba, I think. I have no idea what I said. But at one point, a former boyfriend of mine phoned me and asked me, could he come and see me? And I said, yes. And he came to see me and he said, listen, Viola, everybody I know who knows you says you've gone crazy. Now, I know that you haven't gone crazy. I tell them you haven't, but tell me, have you gone crazy? Because it wasn't done. If one wanted to be spiritual, there were sort of respectable ways to do it, depending on what crowd one went with. In my crowd, Zen Buddhism would have been very respectable. In another crowd, perhaps becoming Roman Catholic might have been. But, somebody called Baba, no. Somebody who said, don't worry, be happy. No. Anyhow, I told him I was no crazier than I had ever been, and not to worry. I also, in those days, the orders would come from India, which was wonderful. That one knew very clearly, don't eat today, which was a much easier thing to try to follow than all the other things, no backbiting and all that. You knew whether you were eating or not. The first order I had that came along when I started was the silence. And my friend through whom I had heard about Baba and I went to the beach the day before. And she was very, very fair. She's still around. And the sun was very bad for her. And we stayed at the beach too long. And she lived fairly near me. And when we parted, she said, now look, if I get sick from sunburn tonight, I'll ring your phone 3 times, hang up, ring again, and that means you come over and help me. So I said, yes. Well, damn it, if that night the phone didn't ring 3 times, stop and ring 3 times again. And I realized I had to go, and she was probably very sick from sunstroke or something. And I had just seen, as I said, I lived on the Lower East Side. I had just seen somebody almost knifed right outside my house late one night. So I didn't want to walk to her apartment. I went downstairs. There was a cab. And without thinking, I got in the cab and I gave the address. As soon as I had done it, I realized I had talked. And I thought, okay, oh yes, and then when he finally, he took me to the place and he said, is this the right place? And I wouldn't say a thing. I just got out and paid him. But I thought, really, I had goofed. The very first thing I was asked to do, I couldn't do. And I felt that that meant I was not worthy to try to follow Baba. And I felt just awful about it. The rest of the day I wrote notes. I took care of my friend. I got all kinds of unguents and lotions for her, and I wrote notes, went to shopkeepers where I'd gone every day talking. But I thought, even if I don't talk now, I can't undo the fact that I've talked, and it means it's finished. I didn't know what to do. I was frantic. When we could talk again, I told Miss Krask, I'd better stop. I can't do this. I talked. And she laughed. And she said, all Baba asks is that you try. And she told me about being in India and taking care of the animals, and sometimes on Silence Day, talking to a dog by mistake. So that it should have made it pretty plain to me that that it was all right to fail. I must say, I have that problem. I sometimes think, I know that Baba is the only thing, but I really am not quite up to following him. Do any of you feel that way? You don't, I know. But one just sort of stumbles along, I guess. And I haven't become a saint yet. Being with Baba was often very difficult for me. I remember in Myrtle Beach in '58, feeling often as though I could practically, physically feel everything in my mind just tossing around in a way that was extraordinarily uncomfortable. And being so conscious of all that sometimes it was hard to pay attention to Baba. Also, during those long mornings in the barn with Baba, it was very, very hot. And I often found it difficult not to sleep, not to sort of nod off. And a lot of other people have confessed to me since that they had this, the same problem. And there was Baba. We were with Baba, and yet it was sometimes extremely difficult to focus on that. We danced for Baba. Paul Taylor, who's a choreographer and who was a friend, made a duet for Peter Saul, who I think some of you know, and me to dance. Miss Krask said none of us have ever danced that well. I don't remember any of it. I do remember Jean Sebron, who was a Frenchman who was living in New York dancing, and Baba taking Jean and having him sit by his side. I remember very little of that. I remember a lot of confusion in '58. But after Baba left, we stayed to clean up. We had rearranged the barn there, and we stayed to put it back in good condition. And for me, it was as though that was when I really felt Baba, after he'd gone and when I was working. And although I say we didn't belong to a group, the other dancers were, for me, extraordinarily kind and helpful. Tex and somebody called Skipper Damon, who has now died. And I felt that they sort of got me through a very difficult time, which had to do with being with Baba. I felt when we were going to go see Baba the last time, that time I might really be ready for it. And of course that was when Baba dropped his body and we didn't go. There are lots of people who've heard about Baba and who one doesn't know what they do about it. When I was in the Cunningham Company, Robert Rauschenberg, who's a painter, was our lighting designer, and he came with us on tour. We used to travel in a VW bus all over the country. And once late at night, in the Arizona desert, everybody else in the bus was asleep. Bob was awake. I was awake. Bob said to me, "Viola, is Baba Christ?" And I thought, well, since he asks, I might just as well answer. And I said, yes. That was all I've ever heard since about it. So Baba is, there are a lot of people who know about him who are never going to come to something like this. And it's interesting to realize that the world is full of people who know of Baba, but we don't know what they're going to do with it, or what Baba does with it. Have you questions? Have you comments? Yeah.
Did Skipper live in the Los Angeles area?
But she did. She worked in Hollywood. Yes.
Did you see her much after the 50s?
Certainly after the 50s, but not after she went to Hollywood. No. Yes.
I was wondering if your parents became Baba lovers. Your parents became Baba lovers?
I know your question. I don't know how you know a Baba lover. They certainly loved Baba. They were not Baba lovers in any kind of organized sense. But actually, well, I'll tell you about that. My father died of cancer, and I went. I was teaching a summer workshop in Wisconsin, and I went to Washington for a weekend to see him, and it actually turned out to be the weekend before he died. And one night, I heard that he was obviously having a horrible nightmare. I kept saying, no, no, no. And so I went into his room. And very, very softly, I just said Baba's name. And he was tossing around in his bed, and he was obviously in some horrible situation. And I went into his room, and I just repeated Baba's name very, very softly. He quieted down. Totally, his face looked totally peaceful, and he really went to sleep, into a deep sleep. Was my father a Baba lover? Also, after he had died, and my mother moved out of the house, one of my sisters and I cleaned out the house because we were going to sell it. And my father had written. He had kept a journal, and part of it was in a kind of shorthand that nobody but he could read, and part of it was in regular writing. And my eldest sister, who is a scientist and very, matter of fact, who's always been very nice about Baba, but it's not her cup of tea. I was cleaning upstairs, and she was cleaning out my father's desk, and she'd gotten this journal. And she said, "Come downstairs, Viola, come down, come down. I found something wonderful." And she saw in his journal, he'd written Baba, and then one of these shorthand scribbles that neither of us could decipher, Christ. My mother, had Alzheimer's disease before that was fashionable. Nobody knew what it was. And so she was in nursing homes and hospitals and in a really very sad state. When she talked, one couldn't quite understand what she was saying. She cried a great deal. And I would fly out sometimes to see her. And again, my eldest sister was around. And her face, she was in her late 70s and 80 when she was going through this. Her face looked like the face of an old child. She had absolutely, the sort of expression lines were gone. And her face just looked blank. And I would sit there and just, with every bit of energy I had, think about Baba. And her face would look normal again suddenly. And I remember my eldest sister being with me once when we were going through this. She said, "What did you just do to her?" She would, somehow, Baba would make her right again for a while. It's also an extraordinary thing that happened to her. I say that what she said was unintelligible. It wasn't entirely. Very often it was, I felt that she was getting rid of all the disappointments she'd had in her life. Her disappointments with herself and with other people. And she had gone with my other sister, who does love Baba, to see a Baba film in California, as a matter of fact. And when my sister drove her home, she had a stroke or heart attack, and she died, as it were. And then they brought her back to life. And during her bringing back to life, it's as though she got rid of everything. And they say that before she died, she was totally peaceful. So maybe that horrible disease was a gift from Baba to her. Baba's gifts can be pretty strange. Yes?
I was wondering if you could tell us, from moment to moment in your daily life, how you know what Baba wants for you to do.
Oh, I don't know. No. I always, absolutely not. I really do, as I say, I stumble along. I'm always amazed at the people who say, "Well, Baba wants me to go to Palo Alto tomorrow." I don't know. Yes?
This is a little bit off the subject, but it's understandable. Did you ask and talk with Baba about certain things, like death?
Oh, I never talked with Baba, and I never really had any questions. It seemed irrelevant. And I don't mean that I understand any of it. But Baba's the answer, whatever it is.